Hey, let me welcome. I don't know if I clicked public on this, so I assume I did. Quiet mode turned on. Hey, can you hear me, Monica? Hey, Monica, can you let me know if you can hear me? Yes, good, cool, thank you. So I'm learning how to drive this Facebook Live thing, and I thought to give me a little more freedom and to you, my head might bob around a bit more now that I've actually got it sitting here, and I'm not holding the phone, basically, so hopefully that's going to make it less, actually more interesting. It frees me up so I'm not got one hand locked in, and then I'm not having to keep my hand steady. So thanks everybody for coming on. I'm hoping you're really enjoying the series, and I might carry it on. We'll see. I'm in Florida. I'm sorry, I'm all over the place at the moment. I am in Finland. we just look at booking Tuscany and St. Petersburg and Greece just yesterday. So we're in Finland for the next 3 weeks and 2 more Saturdays, I believe. And so I'll carry on doing this series over that time. And then when I'm traveling for several weeks, I'm not sure what I'll be able to do, but I'll see if I can carry it on, because I think there's some really interesting questions that need to get answered, and it's about helping people in their whole journeys around how to master this low carb, high fat, ketogenic eating. And today I'm going to divide into 2 sections, and one is about the whole thing I started to realize this week was that what we really want to do with food is we want to feel satisfied. And you don't just want to feel satisfied, we actually want to be satisfied with the results of eating. And I don't know if you've ever had those days where you get up and you're okay until you start eating. And then you eat something and you think, oh, it doesn't feel quite right. And then you think, well, maybe if I eat something else, you become like a personal internal chemist. And so you try eating something else and think, oh, that settles it down a bit and that makes it a bit easier. And then sooner or later you feel a bit grumbly and think, oh, maybe I need something else. And then, so you're sort of adding all these things in. And then all of a sudden you can start to feel quite sick. And I used to do that a lot, 20, 30... It would have been the 80s, so that's 30 years ago, yeah, nearly 40, for the early 80s. So I used to feel that I had actually, in New Zealand we've got dairy milk Cadbury bars. I think you got it here. They're probably about as big as this glass of water almost, and longer. I used to eat a whole one of those, sometimes 1.5, until I got so sick I just had to stop eating. But eating for me has been a real journey, and I don't know if you ever felt that way around food, that if you could only just get it right and keep it right. And I think that's, for me, a big part about what this journey has been, is it's made my day-to-day experience with food a lot more satisfying. And at the same time, it's also about becoming aware of when I need to not eat. So that whole idea I talked about last time about fasting, there's 2 kinds of fasting. One is a dry fast without water, and the other one is a hydrated fast, so you're having water. So it's like, at a certain point, a dry fast is, if you're feeling uncomfortable, a dry fast is actually a really good thing to do, just to basically stop eating, stop putting anything in. So if you ever had an experience like I've just shared with you, and they'll happen and throughout your time with figuring out what to eat, is just try not eating and just go do something else and let your body settle down. So I'm going to do a summary at the end of this, but the first half, so normally I've been doing summaries at the beginning of the last two talks, or the last talks, and what I'm going to do is going to wrap it up at the end, because I wanted to add a piece in here about, we've been talking about the foods that are easy to see and hold, proteins, fats and carbohydrates. You can actually see those, they're the things on your plate. But what's in those things on your plate is what the first part of this is about, is, we tend to take for granted that our food is good quality, meaning it's got all the nutrients in it we need. And this whole thing is about figuring out the fats, proteins, and carbohydrates. That's called the macronutrients. So this piece I want to talk is the micronutrients. Those are the things you can't even see. They're in your food or not, but you can't see them. And it's interesting that I know for me, when I started supplementing my diet, that would have been back in 1990, all of a sudden my experience of satisfaction around food changed, and that I could feel more satisfied more easily. And that was purely because I figured out is that, see, your body, if it's missing something, if it's lacking something, it hasn't got something to drive those essential processes inside, then all it can tell you to do is get me something. And how it does that is it makes you hungry. And so how much of our hunger is actually related to not getting those micronutrients. And so my experience has been that the more I get up to speed with feeding my body those micronutrients, the more satisfied I am around food. And sometimes even when I've noticed that when I've had when I'm starting to feel a bit funny in my body around the food I've eaten during the day, is if I have a supplement, then all of a sudden that all settles down. And so that's that same thing of, it was my body just actually craving more of that nutrient that I wasn't getting in my diet. And there's a lot of doctors that are teaching low carb, high fat or ketogenic diets who really believe that you should just do that. You don't need anything else. And then on the other side, there's a range of doctors that say, yes, that's a really good idea, and you need more. For me, it comes down to that common sense approach that if something's not in the soil, how can it be in the veggies that grow there? How can it be in the animals that live off that soil? And therefore, how can it be in us? And I come from New Zealand, so I'm very much up to speed with New Zealand soils, more so than others. But actually, I did a survey once on like where I am now, Denmark, this whole European area, and there is low counts of things in the soil like we have. So so when Europeans first came to New Zealand, they used to get a lot of goiter, the thyroid would overgrow, and so then they started to pin that down to iodine. The whole idea of micronutrients never really got known to us till the beginning of the 1900s. So it's only been 100 years of experience. I think the last vitamin they found was B12. I think that was about 1948. So again, that's only like 60 years ago. And they still really don't know a lot about things, because there's a great book about salt by a guy called James, see if I can pronounce his name right, Nicolantonio. So James Nicolantonio, I have to speak like an Italian to get that right, he's saying how we're really undersalted because we've been told to eat low salt for a long time. And I did discuss when you lower your carbohydrates, you lower your insulin, and then that lets the kidneys excrete salt, so then you need to add salt in, otherwise you get muscle cramps. So that's one thing. But they're starting to see now that salt is just such an important nutrient, and there's so much misinformation about it. There is actually an idea to get the whole world shifted onto like eating less than 1.5 milligrams of salt. Was it milligrams or grams? I can't remember actually, but it's like really low. Whereas the average, intake now is something like between 3 and 6, and so to get us down to 1.5, so it must be grams a day to 1.5. It's like hardly anyone does that. And at the same time, when you get your salt low, there's lots of evidence that there's a lot of problems come with that. And so it's not really affecting blood pressure that much. There are some people that are, thought to be salt sensitive in terms of blood pressure, but generally it's not really the issue. So that's salt. And another thing I love is when doctors wake up, change their tune. There's been a lot of shift in terms of, hang on a minute, some quotes, some comments coming through. I'll just check if I need to pay attention to these. Okay, no, that's all good. Thank you, guys. So one of my favorite, he's a Scottish doctor, actually, a guy called Malcolm Kendrick, and he wrote the great Cholesterol Con, and he puts a lot of the real issues around heart disease to overstress, cortisol. So it's not really so much, a cholesterol. He says not a cholesterol issue, it's a cortisol issue. And then just reducing the stress to bring that. You don't need to think about your cholesterol level, you need to think about your cortisol. And he is, in some degree, favors vitamins, because he was brought up by a mother who fed him vitamins. And but he had made a quote just earlier this year. What are we now? We're in March. So it was January this year. He did a blog where he said, you really don't need to, there's been a lot come out about magnesium, and you really don't need to worry about it. And then he did an addendum to that blog just because a big study came out at the end of January, just after he'd written it, like within a week or something. And so he had to change his tune, because as he says, that unless you're willing to change with the facts, you're just working on a belief. That's my statement, but that was what the implication of what he said. And so he's one of those great doctors who's willing to change his beliefs when the facts show him something that says his beliefs are wrong. And magnesium was one of those things. It turns out now that it's an amazing thing in terms of heart protection and things like that. So that's something that doctors are now starting to test, as magnesium levels. Another example is folate. It's another vitamin, I believe. I'm not too good on biochemistry, and I don't keep things like that in my head. But think about this: is that folic acid was basically brought out. We realized with the neural tube defects, spinal cord defects, where basically if you've seen a baby come out with one of those, it's a horrible thing. Basically the skin's opened up because it didn't form over, and the spinal cord is just exposed to the air, and different degrees of that. And so we realized that folic acid, was really a good thing for that. And so we found out this is the whole thing of recommended daily amounts, is that, in terms of scurvy, vitamin C, there's a recommended daily amount of vitamin C we need, that below that we know we're going to get scurvy. So you have a minimum. The RDA is a minimum amount. Rickets, vitamin D. Again, there used to be no problem, but then with the industrial age, everyone started working a lot more inside, so vitamin D problems got to be an issue because of the sun. So they thought it was a vitamin issue, didn't realize it was the sun at that point, didn't realize we made more vitamin D than we could ever, take on board with a supplement, even though supplementation is good, helps to absorb other things and things like that. But another one, just this folate issue, is that there's a certain amount of folic acid we need to prevent neural tube defects. But what they're finding out now, that above that, there's a level where it's affecting, it's like forming protective aspect in terms of things like Alzheimer's and dementia. So there's basically levels within levels. There's a great talk by a guy called Gerhard Schrauzer, who was a professor at San Diego, and he's studied minerals a lot, and he said that selenium has something like 23 or 24 different enzymatic reactions it's part of, but those enzymatic reactions don't kick in until you get to certain levels of selenium in your blood and in your cells. And it's another thing about, when people take a blood sample off you and test a level of something, it's one thing to know the level in your blood, but how does that relate to the level in your tissues? So again, there's two different things there. We can only measure the level in the blood, not the level in the tissues. So the whole idea is to start to supplement yourself with more than the RDA. and then you need to figure out what kind of nutrients. And I've looked at nutrition and supplementation since 1990, as I said, so that's 27 years. And the person I like the best in terms of supplements I use is this guy called Dr. Wallach, Dr. Joel Wallach. He's an interesting guy, interesting history. He hasn't necessarily got a user-friendly personality, so he can come across quite abrupt. But what I like is how he came across this. He was a farm boy, went to university, studied soil science, so he understands. That's when he started to understand why his dad was feeding the cows, minerals, but wasn't. He actually solved an issue for himself when he had, I think he was about 8 or 9, and he had a tick in his eyes, and they were calling it something, I forget the name. And but anyway, this is the kind of man he is. He's very book oriented, so he actually did some digging at a very young age into some books at the local library, looking through what causes ticks, and he couldn't find it in humans, and he found it in cows. He said that in cows, if they have facial tics, they feed them calcium. And when he was looking at the feed he was feeding the cows, had calcium in it. So as he said, he threw out a cereal and put in a bowl of cow supplements and put some milk on it and had that for breakfast and handled his tics within 3 weeks. So at the age of 9, he says he felt like he discovered something. And then at the age when he got into university, he did soil science, and then he became a vet. He just thought he was a dumb guy, but the guys watched him, and he was helping with the herds in the university. They had their own herds there. It must have been obviously an agricultural university if they were doing soil science. And they encouraged him to become a vet, and he said, "Oh, well, I'll try that." And so he did, and became a vet. And that was when he understood how the supplementation makes a big difference. Because basically, it's a bit of a cynical kind of thing to think about when oil boils down to it. But we feed our animals well, feed them micronutrients, because it costs us money if we don't feed them well. Basically, I know sheep in New Zealand, they had to start feeding them selenium because their hearts would just blow up, become cardiomyopathy, the heart muscle would become big and flabby, and they would drop down dead before they ever got to a marketable size. So that we understand it in sheep, that in animals, that if you don't feed them well, if you don't give them those micronutrients, then they're not as productive. You can't actually cut them up and sell them and make money on them. And it's in one way it's a pity that's not true for us, but another way it's obviously a good thing. But when you think about it, is that there's no money in us until we either the food company, if they can get us foods that we're personally addicted to, and that's part of the process with food, is get you food that you're addicted to, so you'll eat more of it. And the other side is to eat. There's no money in supplementation because you can't pin a drug down. You can't. They're actually starting. One of the reasons drug companies are looking to stop vitamin supplies and reduce the amounts you can actually personally have. Like in New Zealand, we're allowed less B12 than in the US because of all our laws and regulations. But basically, there's this clampdown on how much you can be able to buy to support your own body according to your own thoughts about what you need. And I was going to say is so one of the reasons if they can actually suppress that and make that illegal to do, then they can create a synthetic vitamin, and then they can patent that, and then they can get money from that. So basically, there's no money in those kind of things, and but there is money in us, buying drugs, or the government's buying drugs, and being sick. I had a mechanic, and I helped him lose weight. He was so excited. He lost something like 20 kgs, and he was really excited, and he told me, and I thought, fantastic. And when I found out why he was so excited was that he could now get the operation because the government is now funding $7,000 so he could get his stomach stapled. And they've been trying for years with a dietitian to get him to lose weight, and he couldn't do it. He couldn't get that 20 kgs off. And now that he got those 20 kgs off, he could go have the operation. And it's like, because he said that, sure, I could carry on, but if I don't carry on now, they're not going to pay for that operation. So we pay for that through our taxes, and this whole, oh God, don't get me started on the cynical rave. But basically, unless we look after ourselves, the powers that be that make money off us, whether we're, basically the sickness industry or the health industry makes, and the companies behind it make more money off us if we're sick and if we're sick for longer. So the whole idea isn't to fix anything, it's actually just to keep you sick so you can stay on the treatments. Fund all those things that really they shouldn't be funding, like bariatric surgery. This guy could have handled it and learned how to make different choices consistently. And the only reason he didn't do that was, yes, it was hard, but the hardest thing was that if he said, and he told me, if he said, if I don't do this now, they may never let me back on the program. Now, isn't that a completely sad thing to make a choice for? So anyway, that's the whole idea of that. We either, there are nutrients in our diets that we actually need in our diets, that if we're not getting them, all these things show up. And I started down this track with the whole idea of getting a minimum amount of nutrients is one thing, and like I said, is that the selenium has a different number of things in the body. Like the body is actually a antioxidant production factory. If you get the ketone, the carbohydrates low enough, the ketones start to come in, and then the body can produce antioxidants. One of the main ones it produces is glutathione, but it won't start producing decent amounts of glutathione unless you have enough selenium. And then it's that body's thing is that it has uses for selenium, but it clicks in at different levels of selenium. So you've got to have really good amounts of nutrients. And that's where you look at the broad spread of what kind of nutrients to have, and therefore, and so there's that whole issue there of that's a difficult challenge to figure out, and then it's the amounts. And Dr. Wallach, what I like about him is that he went from a soil scientist to a vet, having had that early experience with remineralizing himself when he was younger. So he had that personal experience, then he went into the educational process. And then his wife got sick and died of cancer. And that really touched him quite deeply. And at the same time, he was actually looking at rhesus monkeys. He was working with the space program, and some of them were having real problems with rhesus monkeys falling over and dying. And he found out it was nutrient deficiency, and at that time it was cystic fibrosis. He was pinning it down to selenium and a few other things, fatty acids, and a bunch of, I can't remember the exact combination, but and he lost his job, and they basically said, well, everyone knows that cystic fibrosis is a genetic disease. So the whole idea that that funding can basically affect what research we get presented to us and what we get led down a path of. And that happened to him in a massive way. And he says that we have doubled the lifespan of dogs because we feed them better. He actually doubled the lifespan of bears in captivity. So someone like that, I kind of listen to, because he's got the personal experience, he's got the soil science experience, he's got the veterinary experience where he understood about nutrients. And basically, if you look at our digestive system, the dog is the most similar to us in terms of a digestive system. So, if we can double the lifespan of dogs with feeding them, better quality nutrition. And one of the things, I haven't checked it out in New Zealand, but he says if you want a large breed dog to survive as long as a long breed dog, because it tends to be small dogs live longer. It might be like short people. I don't know if there's something like that in it. But he says that often with a large breed dog, they'll give them small breed dog amount of nutrients and just a lot of extra fats, proteins, and carbohydrates. And so that's how they do that. So he says we just need a lot more nutrients, and so that's why the ones I recommend come from him basically. And I have got I'll put it at the bottom of this Facebook Live when it's done. That whole thing around he says the tissue is actually the issue, that our body's got different kind of tissues and they all need different kinds of nutrition, and depending on what tissue you have a problem with will show up the issues of what you're lacking in. And I've got a health evaluation chart you can fill in so you can actually see what you might be lacking in beyond the core essential nutrients that he recommends. So I'm just looking at my notes here. And I think I've covered that pretty well, but basically we do, so for the whole, let's look at this whole series of 4. We've talked about carbohydrates. Well, back up. We're talking about the whole idea of food needs to be a satisfying experience. And so the food, in terms of being satisfied, it's like it needs to be satisfying to your body, and it needs to be satisfied to your mind and emotions. So you need to, and the results, what the food does in your body needs to be satisfying. So it's not just an immediate pleasure thing. You want a satisfying result with food, before you eat, after you eat, and then the results of that food, not just for the hours afterwards, but the days and weeks afterwards. And that's where we all kind of come to this process of thinking that we need to do something different with food, is because we're not satisfied with the results we're getting. And so that's part of that process of really needing to get a grip on nutrients. And we've been talking about the idea of fasting. Sometimes it's really good to stop eating so you can just let your body settle down again. And how fasting actually reduces the circulating blood insulin over a period of time. So reducing your eating window, and some people do really well on a 2-hour eating window. Me, I'm personally on about an 8-hour eating window. So that means like eating between 11 and 1 o'clock and 8 o'clock. That's, as I said before, this is my breakfast so far. I just had some water, having some more now, getting thirsty as I talk. And so for me that works really well. And then it's about defining how many carbohydrates your body particularly works well with. And a simple way to look at that is your waistline. And my waistline starts expanding as soon as I go over 25, 30, 35 grams of carbohydrate a day. And so I need to be going down below 20 grams is really the best way to be for me. And 20 grams, it's really best to look at total grams. I've talked about net and total before, where you take the net is where you take the fiber off the total, because fiber is a carbohydrate. It's just a non-digestible one. So they often take that off. But some people, basically there's a guy called Dr. Eric Westman. He wrote one of my favorite books along with Steve Finney and Jeff Volek, 2 of my favorite guys in this whole area. And it's called A New Atkins for a New You. And if you're going to read one book, that is actually really the best book. But one of the things he says in there in the book, he talks about working with 20 net grams of total carbs. But then he changed his, because he's been working with this for 25 years or so in a clinical setting in Duke University Hospital. So he's a full-on, clinician. And after the book came out, he changed his ideas to 20 total grams. So he said he puts the difference. And I like this way he expresses it. He says, working with total grams is like working with a prescribed medicine where you need to get it from a pharmacy, whereas working with net carbohydrates is more like working with over-the-counter medicine that's just not as effective, or stuff you need to be as critical with. So I like that. For me, that worked. I don't know if it works for you, but so working with 20 grams of total carbohydrates, and knowing that if you're on something that's like, if you're getting insulin like a drug, or you've got a drug that helps your body produce insulin, you may need to reduce that by at least a half on the very first day that you do that. So you have to be very careful with that if you're on drugs like that, because otherwise you can put yourself into hypoglycemia, because you reduce your carbohydrates, you reduce the need for insulin. If you keep pumping in the insulin, that drops your blood sugar below the floor, and that can be fatal. So most people who are diabetic are used to testing their blood sugars and managing their insulin, so you just need to be aware of that if that's you. Same with blood pressure. You can see your blood pressure come right down. And again, if you start getting, that's something you're more likely to work with your doctor with. If you start feeling dizzy, get your blood pressure checked. If you're not using a monitor regularly, and your doctor may need to reduce your blood pressure. Apart from that, those two classes of drugs, low carbohydrate is generally fine for everybody, because the body really prefers to work without ketones as fuel. It's cleaner burning. I love the idea that I think, if I'm remembering the math right, you actually produce 30% less carbon personally if you're burning ketones rather than glucose. And when you take carbohydrates down, you all of a sudden don't become an obligate carbohydrate burner because the body doesn't like it. It can choose the preferred fuel, which is ketones. And that's where, if you get your carbohydrates down, the whole thing about pleasure and satisfaction around food really kicks in, because a lot of carbohydrates drive a lot of addiction. So often it's like that addictive part of food. If you feel like there's a food you can't possibly let go of, that's actually not a pleasure food for you, that's an addictive food. And I say that we've got this triangle that on one side is helplessness on the bottom, and the other side is rebellion. And if you're feeling helpless, like you just can't not eat that food, or if you're feeling rebellious that no matter how good you say it's good for me not to eat it, I'm going to eat that food, then those two things, rebellion and helplessness, if you go up, that's what I call addiction. That's the joining point of those two. It's like a triangle. And it's just a way of seeing that the overarching addiction drives all of those things. And like I say, that you were helpless when you were a baby. You're not a baby now, so you can make your own choices to get better at that. And you're rebellious when you're a teenager, any time up to, I don't know how long that lasted for you. But it's time to get with the program, to actually start to learn to accept what works for you and what doesn't work for you. And if you try the 20 grams total and that works, then it's about learning to accept that and watching out for carb creep as you get used to things. And so reducing the carbs and then increasing the protein often, because particularly if you've been vegetarian, you'll be low protein like I was, and I had to actually learn to eat meat, learn to eat chicken, fish, do all those kind of things. And it's really hard to do low carb, high fat as a vegetarian. It is possible, harder as a vegan, but it's one thing I would question the need for, and I'm a bit like a raw form smoker on that, so I better not get started. That whole idea, how reform smokers can be really upfront with smokers in the room. So I'm not going to do that. But there's a book called The Vegetarian Myth, which is one of my recommended books for that, by Leah Keith. And so you get your protein. You need to get your proteins up. So the idea is to eat enough protein to feel sad. Protein is your major satisfaction food, and If you got your carbohydrates down, so you don't have that insulin drive to eat, simple carbs, sugars, all that kind of stuff going on. You got your carbohydrates down. Then if you're not feeling satisfied, it's likely because you're not eating enough protein. And the key is to it'll change with age. As you age, you need more because you just don't absorb it as well. You think you need less, but you actually need more. If you exercise more, you need more. Your body size, whether you're a man or a woman, all of those will affect that. And there are formulas you can look at, and I think I've put that before to do that. But basically, if you think about 1.5 grams of protein for total body weight, that'll probably be in a good enough figure. So I weigh 60 kgs, and so I need to be looking at about 90 grams of protein a day. So that's kind of what I aim for. Sometimes that's difficult for me to do. I tend to be more comfortable around the 50 or 60, but if I start feeling like I'm snacking on things, then that's my cue. I need to eat more protein. And we've talked about fat. It's called a low-carb, high-fat diet, and it's a bit of a misnomer in the sense that you don't actually need to eat a lot of fat. I said the other day that a palm-sized piece of protein, thickness and take off the fingers, and that's another simple way to look at your protein needs. Palm-sized piece of protein 3 times a day, or if you're eating twice a day like I do, 1.5 palms twice a day, and with fat, a thumb. But I did the experiment. I cut off a bit of butter about the size of my thumb, and weighed it, and it comes in at about just over 20 grams of fat. And when you think about protein, so we wanted to mention this because the reason you don't actually need to add a lot of fat to your normal meals if you're eating non-vegetarian, if you're eating meats and chickens and fish, is that when you look at most meats, most fish, like, well, I'm talking about fatty fish like salmon, so maybe not most fish. I haven't looked at white fish like snapper, but if you're eating most of those things, they have a 1-to-1 ratio of protein to fat. So if you have 20 grams of protein, eggs are another example, cheddar cheese is another example, about 1-to-1 fat to protein. But then when you look at the calorie difference, so say you have, and like 100 grams of meat has 25% of that is protein, so a quarter. So let's look at 80 grams of meat, you've got 20 grams of carbohydrate, of protein, sorry, no carbohydrate, and you got 20 grams of fat. That's roughly what you've got. But remember, fat has 9 calories per gram compared to protein at 4 calories per gram. So when I look at my piece of, adding in a piece of fat about that size, I'm only going to do that if I'm having something like chicken, and I'll do that, because a lot of people make this mistake. They hear that idea of low carb, high fat, and they think, oh, I can add in cream, I can add in butter, I love that stuff, and then they just go crazy on that, and they wonder why they're not losing weight. It's because they're actually overdoing the calorie thing, because they're overdoing fat. And when you look at that one thumb, I'm a small guy, I'm only like 5'5", 5'6", and 20 grams, that's 180 calories. So if I had 3 of those a day, that's 360, that's 500 to 600 calories. And that's a lot, just in 3 little pieces of butter or cheese. Well, not cheese, sorry, because cheese is 50% protein, 50% fat. So, but butter. So a lot of people do those, bullet coffees where they just add in, butter. And I do that. I have coffee or some kind of drink like a low carbohydrate cocoa with some butter. And I might have 1 or 2 of those a day. And I'll have like half a thumbful worth of butter in that. So it's not like it's a whole amount. So just that whole idea of looking at, if you drop the carbohydrates, if you can bring your protein up to a good amount, if you don't worry about fat too much, particularly if you've got body fat to lose, your body will give you all the fat you ever could use. And if you're having problems with getting it off, it's possibly because you're eating too much fat. So, and then remember that, your protein choices are generally equal amounts of protein and fat. And then you need to look at the mineralization of your body, so to make sure that you're getting enough nutrients so that even though you're looking after all those other things, you're also satisfying your body's need for micronutrients. And that's really about, you can go through the last 3 talks I've done on, I did fasting and fats. Last time I did protein the time before and carbohydrates the time before. You can go through those for some nitty-gritty. But this is about pulling that all together in terms of bringing that point home that we're really eating to feel satisfied. And not just satisfied with how we're feeling now, but satisfied with the results of what it is, whether that's in terms of energy levels, whether it's in terms of we're just not hungry 2 hours after. And that's what happened to me, is that, if when I'm eating, when I've got that right, and it's a matter of you exploring your particular choices and getting the carbs below 20 grams total is like number 1. Getting the protein up is number 2. If you do that without adding extra fats in, you've probably got it all handled. And then you're getting your those 20 grams of carbohydrate. It's really about getting that from vegetables. Unless you're on warfarin or something, broccoli, green leafy vegetables are good. The stalk and the broccoli, like a lot of people throw away the stalk. The stalk's good for as a prebiotic, because that's actually better for a prebiotic than the flowering head. So it can help with the gut bacteria. And if you basically, a cup or 2 of low carbohydrate, it's called another way to look at it is above ground veggies a day. 1 cup is usually plenty. You might, and then a couple of cups of salad greens if you like that. And then for me, you do need to watch alcohol in the beginning, so I recommend going alcohol-free for the first month to give yourself some stability. And then you can count your carbs, and there's different points of view, whereas in a 100 ml glass of wine, a lot of people pour like 250 mils, but in a 100 ml glass of wine, it depends on what the wine is you're looking at. There's different in what charts you look at, but there's between 1 or 2 to 5 grams of carbs in a glass of wine. If I had any kind of addiction, it would be chocolate, and I like Lindt 90%, and I know that in one of those squares of Lindt 90%, there's 1.4 grams of carbohydrates, so I count that. And I do have supplements that have some carbs in it, so I count those carbs in the supplements. And so you need to be aware of everything. If you get something that's got a label, it'll tell you how many carbohydrates are in it. If you have something that hasn't got a label, if it's just a food, I recommend going to Google and typing in the name of the food plus the word nutrition, and look for, usually on the side it'll show you a breakdown, and you can choose like one of these or 100 grams of that, and work out your total carbs from that, and then just put it into action. And with the main point is that you are looking for satisfying results. And hopefully that's been enough of a wrap-up. And I know there's a bunch of people on. I'll see if there's any questions here. No other questions. Thanks everyone for looking. Hopefully this series is working out well for you. Next week I was looking at doing the fitness actually. Fitness is two things. It's emotional, mental, and it's physical fitness. I'd like to handle those things in one leap. And then after that, I'm really not sure. That might be enough to cover this whole series. And you can just keep reviewing them and keep going back. Like, one thing I've noticed for myself is that I'll put these ideas into action and I'll get some results, and then I'll slip. And then depending on how far I slip, depends on how soon my weight comes back on again. And then it's just a matter of me getting back into gear. And sometimes that's an easy thing, and sometimes that takes a bit of discipline. So one of the things I will say, if you're one of those people that, like, I've seen this happen, people lose a lot of weight and are feeling really good, and then they think this thought, it goes something like this, it goes, a little bit of this won't hurt. And so your task is to find out whether that's true or not, because I have seen people that have said that about one cracker wake up 3 months later with a lot of weight coming back on. So that really talks to how addictive certain foods are. So you'll have your own Achilles heels, really, and it's about, I just know for myself, paying attention to that whenever I have that thought, a little bit of this won't hurt, I've learned to take that with a grain of salt. It really isn't going to work. So I've got my own little vices, and they're chocolate, 90% chocolate, and alcohol occasionally, not a lot, but those kind of things you really need to watch out for. Is, do they actually trip you up and make you fall flat on your face and lose touch with actually what's real for you? So that's part of it. The other thing about treating food is the satisfaction you want from food is really the satisfaction of being happy with yourself as a person, and that is how you feel, how you look, and it's not just an immediate satisfaction. So watch those immediate satisfactions. It's very hard to get addicted to a steak. It's like something that you eat, but being addicted to it, you might want it, but it's not something you're going to eat until it makes you that sick. And so that's that whole thing, is that the addictive foods tend to be the carbohydrate type foods, and those are the things you need to be very, very careful with when you're actually doing this on a long-term basis. And that's part of what we'll talk about next week, is the mental, emotional shifts and what to bring to bear to that whole process of making this a long-term satisfying life. And that's ultimately, I think, what we're really all looking for. So I have talked enough. Thanks so much for being on, and I hope that's added one or two other pieces, because often it's just those one or two pieces you pick up on a talk that actually just ring true for you, and you actually put into action and make use of, and find that, yeah, that does actually work. Hopefully that's working. This is going to help you do that. Guys, I see that a whole bunch of you are watching. I really appreciate it. I could call out names, but I don't want to leave people out as well. And thanks again. Have a great week. Maybe I'll show you a little bit. I did a post. I'm in Finland, looking at, this is outside the window, and it's snowing. And I don't know if you can see the snow, but I put a post that Finland, where it has to warm up to start snowing. Because when we're down at like -20 or something like that, it's been really clear. But when we go to -5, that's when the snow starts, and it's been a great experience. It's there's a certain level of stillness here that I've never experienced anywhere else, and I'm not sure if it's the snow, the lack of birds, or just there's very little wind. And there's an incredible experience of stillness and peace out there. And if you ever get a chance to get to Finland, enjoy. Okay. Thanks again for everybody for being on. Love to share information with you, and really, really hope that you pick up on it and it helps you. Bye for now.